That's good.
Oh,
Weird noises.
that's Margaret is really big.
Yeah, I'm trying to mute everybody so we don't get that, but nearly there.
You're going to start off by giving us a song, Jonathan?
On my guitar or my ukulele. Absolutely. Only if Sue's going to join me in it.
Oh,
You know, we got a musical introduction.
right, everyone, it's 10:30. Good morning to you all. It's nice to be at it again. I won't take up time now, but before we go our separate ways, I'll give you feedback that I had when I asked the question about our future. So we'll go straight into the judges session now. And before the end of the session, I'll tell you what people said about how we go forward. So without further ado, Madam, it's yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Lovely to be back. Lovely to see you all again. Hope we've stayed well. I say I've had COVID, but not very badly. Been very lucky. Well, not lucky to get COVID, but lucky to not have horrible side effects. So yeah, we'll start right in straight away. The reign of George V, 1910 to 1936, which we can't quite remember, but we are getting close to the kind of history that isn't history, that is actually what people can remember. George V was born prematurely. Princess Alexandra had a history of having premature babies, 8 months gestation, born 1865, and christened George Frederick Ernest. And immediately Queen Victoria complained. She was very fond by this time of complaining about practically everything. She complained about the name George, oddly, because she said it was only came in with a Hanoverian. She wanted a sort of German name, but not George. So she'd insisted, I think I remember telling you this, she'd insisted that all the children, the whole family, if it was a girl, they got to have Victoria in their name. And if it was a boy, they must have Albert in their name. So this child was called Albert Victor, but then, typical of this royal family, they then always called him Eddie, never called him by his name. So George V's family he was the second born. He was the equivalent of Prince Andrew or Prince Harry, the Duke of York when he was older, and 3 sisters, Maud, Victoria, and Louise. And they did have another child who died within 24 hours. The upbringing was rather strange for royalty. Princess Alexandra was a very sweet-natured woman, very attractive. Everybody sort of took to her, loved her, thought she was wonderful. She had been brought up, she was a Danish princess, in a very laid-back kind of way, a lot of emphasis on outdoor activities, unusually for that time, climbing trees and so on. So she was very boisterous and full of activity, and loved games and loved practical jokes, and was really quite infantile. People found that out later, that she liked things like sliding downstairs on a tin tray, even when she was queen, and sliding down balusters, polished balusters. She was full of sort of high spirits and fun, and that's what she wanted for her children. not particularly interested in education. And her husband, of course, having had a very, very strict upbringing, Prince Albert sort of dictating how many hours they should spend in the classroom. King Edward, or Prince of Wales, as he was when the children were born, he wasn't particularly interested in forcing his children to have the kind of education he'd had. So he was quite laid back about the children. Princess Alexandra spoiled the children very much. She just absolutely loved children. She loved them and cuddled them and made a fuss of them and praised them. And according to Queen Victoria, they were really horrible children. I mean, she didn't like children very much anyway, as we know. And the quote is, "They are such ill-bred, ill-trained children. I can't fancy them at all." Whenever they came to visit, she found fault with them because they were restless and they wanted to play. On one famous occasion, I haven't written this in the notes, but on one famous occasion, Georgie was so naughty that Queen Victoria banished him and said he got to go under the table in disgrace because he couldn't behave properly at the table. He was restless and he was wriggling about and saying, "Can I get down?" He was 2 years old. And so he had to go under the table as a punishment. And it all then went very quiet. And everybody was thinking, oh, he's considering what he's done wrong and he's going to come out and perhaps apologise. And then when he did come out, he got no clothes on. He got undressed while he was under the tablecloth and for a joke. And most people did laugh. This little pink creature came wriggling out from under the table with no clothes on, knowing even at 2 years old, he knew that would shock everybody. And it did. But that was showing that he got really quite a strong personality when he was a toddler. So he was the second born. It was never intended that he should become king. The firstborn, poor Eddie, was regarded, as the years went by, as being very backward. You know, they didn't mince words in those days. They said some people said he was half-witted. He was very apathetic, very quiet, a slow developer. He had been born very prematurely, and he was only 3 pounds when he was born, which is a good size for a premature baby. So the theory now is, the belief is that it was either because he was so premature, or, and very modern theory, is that he'd inherited the Danish family's recessive gene for deafness. And deafness wasn't always picked up, even in fairly recent years. That children just appeared to be listless and a bit sleepy. Prince Eddie was often described as being sleepy, not paying attention. His concentration skills were very poor, that he couldn't concentrate for very long. His mind seemed to drift away from what he was doing. He just couldn't, he really couldn't concentrate. And his tutors found that very, very difficult to cope with. So it could have been undiagnosed deafness. Certainly Princess Alexandra, later Queen Alexandra, by middle age was profoundly deaf. Profoundly deaf. Another theory is that he'd inherited dyspraxia from his father, which involves lack of concentration and misunderstanding things and not focusing properly. There was certainly something, but of course it was never diagnosed. Princess Alexandra described her son as a bit slow and a bit dawdly. Rather interesting. She didn't think there was a tremendous problem. They chose a rather unsuitable, the royal family chose a rather unsuitable tutor for their sons, Reverend John Dalton, not a very good teacher, but a very respected vicar who would teach them discipline and moral codes, and certainly he did that. when somebody called Canon Duckworth took charge of the Prince's One holiday, he famously announced that they knew nothing. He was wondering what on earth they had been taught, what had they been doing for years. With Reverend John Dalton, they didn't seem to know anything, which is probably rather an exaggeration. He was particularly concerned that at the ages of 8 and 9, so Prince George was 9, and was 8, and Eddie was 9, they couldn't speak a word of French. It doesn't seem all that shocking to us nowadays, but apparently it was then. And even George had poor concentration skills. He was very restless and lively, and wanted to be active. He didn't like sitting at a desk and doing his lessons. The solution to this, particularly Prince Eddie's lack of progress, was to send them into the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy would sort them out. They would be trainee midshipmen. They would learn discipline and they would flourish. That was the theory anyway. And George took to this straight away. He loved the nautical life. He loved every element of it and flourished. Poor Eddie failed all his exams. He just couldn't. He wasn't academic at all. And he was so slow. He never finished any of the papers. But they were together. The plan was that George, with his liveliness and his stronger personality, would help his older brother. There's only a year between them. That he would be a kind of prop for his brother. The only problem with poor Prince George was that he was short and he was nicknamed Shrimp by fellow midshipmen. And in all the photographs of him later, when he became king, he is quite a lot shorter than most of the men that he was photographed with. And I think this actually was a problem for him. Might account for why he was so severe and angry with his sons, who were all quite tall. That he was, in all the photographs of him during the First World War, the men he's talking to are taller than he is. So kind of a bit of a problem with that. He was bullied in the Navy quite badly, partly because he was small and partly because he was royal. You know, the other lads took his money and he had quite a difficult time, but he came through it all right. But poor Prince Eddie didn't really make any progress at all. And there are pictures of the princes. There's a famous one of him they're learning knot craft. They're doing some kind of thing with knots, and Prince Eddie is looking at Prince George. He's watching his brother instead of the other way around. He's watching to see how to do these knots. He's sort of following his younger brother. The decision then was to send them off on a naval training ship to do some world cruises, because the future King of England, King of the Emperor, ought to know something of the world. And again, Prince George flourished. He qualified as a midshipman. Everybody liked him. They thought he was cheerful and hardworking and very much at ease with other ranks. Very important for a future king, you might say, although there was no question that he wasn't going to be a future king. He was the spare. There was an heir and a spare, and he was not the heir. Poor Prince Eddie continued to fail every exam he ever took, whereas George, by contrast, gained first-class grades in gunnery, torpedo work, and seamanship, and in 1885 was promoted to lieutenant, and very similar career to that of the Duke of Edinburgh, doing really well in the Navy, having found his place in life, something that he was really good at and that he really enjoyed. Lots of photographs of him looking really happy, wearing his naval uniform. Prince Eddie continued to be a problem. The good thing about Prince Eddie was that he had impeccable manners. The royal family had insisted on that. He had lovely manners. He was gentle. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He had a lot of golden qualities, but he really didn't seem able to cope with life itself. You know, he really wasn't very bright. So rather like his father, it was like, well, we've got to find him a suitable bride. We've got to find him a suitable wife that will sort of help him and be a really supportive consort. That's what he needs. He needs the love of a good woman. So they started to hunt around. Queen Victoria, of course, very involved. She believed she was a very, very good matchmaker, and they got a huge range of princesses and duchesses all over Europe to choose from, except they had to be Protestant, of course. Meanwhile, Prince Eddie was going off the rails. He was going to what the equivalent now would be, he was going clubbing, he was going to nightclubs, some of which were rather inappropriate for royalty. There are all sorts of rumours abounding that some of them were very, very unsuitable, and that he was actually gay. And that's never really been dealt with. You know, a lot of it is rumour. There's not very much substantial evidence, but at the time it was believed that he was frequenting some very, very inappropriate sort of dives in London. So it became a very urgent issue. He got to get married. In the meantime, he'd fallen in love with a French princess, Princess Hélène. I mean, they hadn't got a proper royal family in France anymore. They were in exile, but he'd fallen in love, and she appeared to be in love with Prince Eddie. And the letters he wrote her show that he wasn't backward. There are some lovely letters, well expressed, using quite long words appropriately. So another mystery, why he was thought to be so backward when he could write such lovely letters. However, she was prepared to convert to Protestantism, but it wasn't considered a very suitable match for all sorts of reasons. In the meantime, the royal family had found a suitable match, and that was Princess Mary of Teck. Well, Princess Mary, who later became Queen Mary, our present Queen's grandmother, had an odd family background, and explains why she was so shy. That was one problem. She was very, very, very shy. Her mother was enormously fat, and they used the word fat in those days. They didn't sort of call it like large, or they were. She was called Fat Mary. The family nickname for it was Fat Mary. She was usually offered a settee to sit on in public, because if she sat on the chair, she was sort of overflowing the chair on either side. Or if it was a chair with arms, she got stuck. And on one famous occasion, she sat on a very beautiful, rather delicate gold chair at Buckingham Palace, and the chair collapsed. And poor Princess May was mortified and humiliated by this large mother who's a joke in the family. And her father, Francis of Teck, Duke of Teck, was always in debt. He was hopeless with money, and he wasn't the real McCoy when it came to royalty. She was it was a morganatic marriage. So the mother was properly royal, but father wasn't. Plus, he was always scrounging. He was notoriously in debt, and scrounging for the members of the family. So poor Princess Mary really had a difficult background. I mean, they weren't begging from door to door or anything like that. And she had a very cultured. She was understood about art, and she was good. She was musical. She had all the right qualifications, except her family background wasn't, to many people, not appropriate. But she had the right kind of personality. She was gentle and very concerned with duty. That was the mainstay of her life, really. Duty, being dutiful, being a dutiful daughter, and putting up with things. She'd already had an experience of putting up with people saying nasty things about her mother's size, and saying nasty things about her father being in debt, and he often spoke inappropriately and said embarrassing things. So She'd learned to be very discreet, and that was seen as a very big plus point, because she would have to be long suffering if she was going to marry Eddie. You know, he wasn't going to be an easy marriage partner.
Can I ask, I ought to know what morganatic means.
It means not properly royal, and therefore not, I mean, it's a legal marriage, but you're not going to be part of the royal family.
Right, right.
It's a sort of,
Well, that was spoken about in terms of,
it's when it is a legal marriage, but it's not, it's regarded as dodgy.
right, got it.
So
Sorry.
anyway, it went, it went ahead. The plans went ahead, and the couple got engaged. And Prince Eddie, being lethargic and apathetic, sort of went along with it. In spite of the fact that he was in love with somebody else, you know, he went along obediently with this plan, this arranged marriage. And then tragically, he died. Prince Eddie died. And it was in the paper a couple of days ago that they think it was an early kind of coronavirus that swept the country. A very virulent kind of flu, which turned to pneumonia in his case. And on the 14th of January, 1891, he died. Now, there wasn't widespread grief. The country didn't go into mourning, because there were all these rumours about how inappropriate he would be as a king, how inadequate he would be. But the royal family themselves were absolutely devastated. And poor Princess Alexandra said she was never going to get over losing her son. And if you go to Sandringham and you go to the church, there's all sorts of very, very moving ways of remembering him, like, and she actually, Princess Alexandra, later the Queen, had plaques put it up in the church. This was his pew, this was his prayer book, this was his hymn book, this is where he sometimes sat. And she put these just in memory of her son. She never really recovered from the shock of losing this son, that she not just mothered him, she tried to protect him, because she knew that he was, as she said, dawdly, slow and dawdly, and that had brought out her already very strong maternal instincts. So suddenly George was the heir to the throne. And Queen Victoria was very anxious that they shouldn't lose this pearl that she described May of Teck, Princess May of Teck, as a pearl. They mustn't lose her. You know, they'd vetted her, she was ideal, so she could marry George. And which is what happened. It began as an arranged marriage and later became a very solid, loving relationship. They were both quite shy, and famously couldn't say anything to each other about how they felt. They wrote each other letters, they wrote notes to each other about what they really felt, how much they loved each other. Very moving. That they were both shy and somewhat inhibited, but that there was genuine love there, really genuine love. And she did make a wonderful consort, Queen Mary, that some of us can remember. So before he came to the throne, Prince George was even more a mummy's boy than he had been before, because now he was the only son left, and Princess Alexandra made a huge fuss of her little Georgie boy, she called him, and he called her Mother Dear, which made some people think, yuck. Even at the time, thinking, you know, to keep calling, when he'd grown up, keep calling him, and writing the most amazing letters to his mother when he was at sea. You know, really, really openly, very, very affectionate. She became, Princess Alexandra did become a sort of nightmare mother-in-law when they got married and they moved into York Cottage, which is in the grounds of Sandringham. And they got their furniture from Maples, because the royal family was sort of trying to be ordinary and not pretentious. And George, having been in the army, in the Navy, liked quite plain, practical things. And poor Princess Mary, or Princess May, had very good taste and would have liked antique furniture, or at least tasteful furniture, but no, it was all delivered. And then not only did she not have any say in the decor in her own house, her mother-in-law had chosen it all. Mother-in-law that kept coming round and rearranging the furniture without permission, just saying, well, you know, I've moved everything around because I think it'd be better if you had the table in the window, that kind of thing. And Princess Mary learned just to smile and accept what was happening, but her mother-in-law was just going to continue as if the marriage hadn't really taken place, that she was still the boss and she was still going to tell her son you know, what to do and how to behave and so on. But again, because of her upbringing, because Mary had been taught to be long-suffering and silent and discreet, she coped with her nightmare mother-in-law. They never fell out. She never said anything. But she did confide sometimes in ladies in waiting that she probably felt she wanted to strangle her mother-in-law because she was so interfering. So in 1901, of course, everything changed. Queen Victoria died. Bertie became Edward VII, and George became the Prince of Wales, the heir to the throne, still known as the Duke of York, rather confusingly. He spent a lot of time visiting the empire, especially India and Burma, doing what is now very inappropriate, shooting tigers. Lots of photographs of the king with a pile of tigers. I mean, not just shooting one, but a pile of tigers surrounded by Indian servants, and the king usually standing with his foot, well, sorry, the prince standing with his foot on one of the tigers to sort of show, you know, I shot this tiger. And I remember when I was little, lived in Leeds, and Leeds had a good museum. And one of the first things you saw when you walked into the museum was a huge glass case with a rather faded tiger in it, that had gone kind of cream coloured instead of, because it had been there such a long time. And this was a tiger not shot at this particular time, but shot in the 1920s by this time, King George V. And even when I was little, I thought, poor tiger. You know, what had it done wrong? Why did they shoot it? I remember asking my mother, what had it done? I thought it was a man-eater or something. You know, they'd done it because it was pouncing on people and eating them. And she said, oh, people just did it for sport. And I remember, even when I was little, thinking that's shocking. Poor tiger all ending up in a glass case just because somebody felt like shooting it. And every time we went, I went and sort of commiserated with this with this fading tiger. And eventually it got something in its fur. I don't know what it was. It started to fall to bits and they had to remove the tiger. I remember that was in the Yorkshire Post, that this
Got mites.
wonderful, got something that his fur was all falling out. And so they had to remove it. So so jumping forward, which we did, the last time I spoke to you, we just lost Edward VII in the middle of this constitutional crisis. So we have done Edward VII's reign. He died in the middle of this very big constitutional crisis about the power of the House of Lords. They had rejected what was called the People's Budget, and so they had laid themselves open to massive criticism. But it needed sorting, because if the Lords could reject a budget, they could reject any legislation which they disapproved of, and they certainly disapproved of a great deal of the liberal government's legislation, because it was the beginning of the welfare state, and the Lords were, on the whole, against the idea of a welfare state. They thought people should just work hard and you know, go into the workhouse when they were old. They shouldn't depend on the state at all. That was anathema to many of the Lords. So there it was a big constitutional crisis. The Lords versus the Commons, or sometimes it was described as the Lords versus the people. So the poor king, poor George V, who hadn't been trained for to become the monarch, he'd been trained for the navy, became king and inherited no end of problems. You know, it was an absolute baptism of fire. First of all, party warfare over the Parliament Bill, Irish Home Rule, which was becoming incredibly contentious, that Ulster was saying, we are Protestant, we don't want Home Rule, we don't want to be an independent, we don't want to be with Catholic, the rest of Ireland, we want to stay with the United Kingdom. That was becoming a major issue. Trade union militancy, we'll come back to, and the threat from Germany, German naval threat, military aggression. Germany now a united country since 1871, but with a very strong Prussian culture of militarism. Germany was becoming a problem. And so the poor king, who hadn't really served an apprenticeship, found he was facing all these problems all at the same time. So to take them sort of one at a time, what was going to happen about the parliamentary problem, the constitutional problem. Asquith, the Liberal Prime Minister, asked King George, to dissolve Parliament, and then there's a secret undertaking which takes you back to the reign of William IV, same situation, Lords refusing to accept Commons legislation, a secret undertaking that he would create 500 Liberal peers, 500, huge number, to swamp the built-in Conservative majority in the House of Lords. So it was a Liberal government, but the House of Lords was Conservative, far more Conservative members than Liberals or any other. So they could keep throwing out legislation with the power that they had. They could just not accept legislation that had come up from the House of Commons. However, if the king was willing to make peers, just choose people and make them into peers, life peers, then that majority in the House of Lords would be cancelled out. And the king was very, very upset about that, the whole concept, just as William IV had been. That it seemed unconstitutional to be interfering in politics in that way. But he hated the secrecy aspect. I have never in my life done anything I was ashamed to confess, and I have never been accustomed to conceal things. So this was this very honest man saying, you know, with his naval training and everything, that he'd never been put in that position, and he hated being put in that position by the Prime Minister. So December 1910, the second general election in that year, there'd been one in January and there's another one in December, dead heat again, didn't solve anything. But the House of Lords had divided itself into what were called hedgers and ditchers. The hedgers were the ones who were willing to compromise. Even though they were Conservatives, they were willing to compromise for the sake of the nation. The ditchers, led by somebody called Lord Willoughby de Brooke, said they would die in the last ditch rather than surrender their power, and that they wouldn't accept well, they didn't even know what Asquith was planning, but they probably suspected that he was planning using the king's power to swamp them, creating Liberal peers, which would be a huge intervention and change in the constitution. So the ditchers were the ones who said they would die in the last ditch, and the press got hold of it and called them the ditchers, and the hedgers were the ones, you know, we know that expression, if you hedge it means you're willing to compromise. You're not quite as hard line as the ditchers. And so people wondered what was going to happen. if kind of parliamentary war was going to break out, luckily, the Ditchers decided to abstain. And so the new legislation was passed by 17 votes. The terms of the Act, what were the Lords actually voting about? The House of Lords would no longer have the power, and this is what applies today. The House of Lords would no longer have power to veto a bill already ratified by the House of Commons. They would no longer, they could delay a bill by up to 2 years. But ultimately, it would be passed. And the lifespan of Parliament was reduced from 7 to 5 years, which it now is. General election every 5 years, which is much more democratic than 7 years, which it had been for centuries. So that was sorted at the last minute, everybody holding their breath, thinking, what are the Lords going to do? Are they going to make it a huge constitutional civil war? People were talking about it being a kind of civil war, a war of words, and people just digging their toes in and refusing to compromise. So that was sorted, much to the King's relief, sighs of relief all round, that the Lords basically capitulated. They didn't exactly, they weren't like turkeys voting for Christmas, they just didn't vote. They abstained. The hardliners abstained. But the King still had to face other serious problems, and his government had to face serious problems. The years 1910 to 14 described as the Great Unrest. Strikes, walkouts, go-slows, lockouts, constant trouble. 1,200 strikes in 1913 alone. People tend to think in a kind of nostalgic way that the period before the First World War was a kind of golden age of calm and peace and beautiful summers and everybody just having a lovely time, and then the war came along and ruined everything. And it wasn't like that at all. Not at all. It was a time of great unrest, and people in authority and people in the establishment and government worrying all the time about the state of the nation. Various reasons for this situation, and growing levels of violence, that the working classes were not just accepting their lot in life. They weren't just accepting it as they had done in the past. They were becoming violent. The strikers died in clashes with police. So what was going on? Why was this happening? Well, first of all, high living costs and low wages. Wages, because in the capitalist system, you pay wages as low as you can to make maximum profit for your shareholders. Huge increase in trade union membership. Trade unions were beginning to be effective when it came to strikes, and so that attracted more members. So enormous power, certain unions having enormous power. People paid a weekly, well, they paid their union dues, and that meant that there was enough money in the kitty. So when there was a strike, men could stay out of not working for weeks because they got strike pay. Whereas in earlier times, men couldn't stay out, or women couldn't stay off work because they were starving. They had to go back, usually for a lower rate of pay. So trade unions were becoming powerful, and they had money to support longer strikes, effective strikes. Technological developments were actually taking away jobs. And there was the influence of new organizations, communists, socialists, syndicalists. Because we have free speech in this country, lots of people standing on soapboxes, on street corners, talking about the unfairness of life and how some people were barely able to live on their pitiful wages, other people, millionaires, spending money like water, having banquets and going abroad, and wives covered in pearls and diamonds and so on, pointing this out, raising political awareness. Of course, they were described as rabble rousers by the people that had the money. But there was a great deal going on of what we call raising political awareness and raising social awareness of the inequalities in life. Some people have described the Edwardian era as one of the periods in our history when there's been the most marked difference between the workers and the bosses. J.B. Priestley's famous play, An Inspector Calls, actually picks up on this. The difference. Did the people with the money actually care about the workers at all? Did they even consider them? Or were they just making money for the rich? That was their job. They made money for the rich. The lower the pay, the more the profit. So there were all sorts of problems growing, and also growing solidarity between the different trade unions, that if one union went out on strike, they sometimes made a kind of like a treaty, like an alliance with another. Like if the dockers came out, the railway men would come out. If the miners came out, then the dockers would come out, that sort of thing. That was developing and becoming a problem. Well, depending which side you were on. For example, 1911 to 1912, dock strikes, the railway workers struck in sympathy, almost bringing the country to a standstill for a few days or a few weeks. When the strike pay ran out, of course, then people had to go back to work. So many strikes were unsuccessful, but it was showing the power, the rising power of the working classes, that they weren't prepared to just work and then die never having had any fun. They were, that wasn't the situation anymore. Then, of course, we've got the suffragettes. So it wasn't bad enough that the workers were becoming incredibly stroppy. The women were becoming incredibly stroppy. Oh. And that was sort of, a lot of people just found that absolutely unbelievable, that the women who'd been so biddable in the past, you know, the helpmate, the angel of the home, they were called. The Victorians are very sentimental about women. The angel of the home, they just had to live at home and bring the children up, and the men sorted everything out and read the papers and were interested in politics. Women weren't supposed to know anything about politics. It was very bad for them. Many doctors and physicians actually believed that if women got involved in politics, it would damage their childbearing apparatus, which does seem a bit weird today, but it was a genuine belief that if women were interested in politics or tried to gain political power, they would gradually turn into men, and then they wouldn't be able to have babies. And the first time I heard about this, I thought, what rubbish. And then I researched it while I was at university, and some very eminent physicians totally believed this, totally believed it. Same thing with women's education, that if women were educated, they would gradually turn into men. Oh. So there you have it. Like, it wasn't just, we don't want to share political power with women. It will damage them. They won't be good wives and mothers anymore. Interesting, the Queen Victoria absolutely hated the idea of women having any kind of political power. She thought it was dreadful, absolutely dreadful. So I don't talk about suffragettes, so I think we might even do that separately, because it's a really important and interesting subject. What had happened was that the suffragette movement, as we know it, the Women's Social and Political Union, to use their correct title, suffragettes was a nickname. They wanted suffrage, which was the vote, and ets meant women. So suffragettes was not contemptuous, but it was a sort of a nickname. That wasn't what they called themselves. They were the Women's Social and Political Union. And their watchword, their motto was deeds, not words. There could be many other groups going back a couple of centuries, fighting for political equality, and they'd got nowhere, absolutely nowhere. And of course, to start with, although it was started in 1903 by the Pankhursts, and at first the same thing happened. They got lots of members, but they weren't achieving anything. They kept petitioning the House of Commons, please can we have the vote? No, go away, you silly women, go away, stop being ridiculous. Of course you can't have the vote. Even the Prime Minister didn't believe in it. Winston Churchill, hardly anybody believed that in power. Hardly any of the men in power believed that women should have the vote. It wasn't an entitlement at all. It was ridiculous. So, after years of failure, although they weren't failing to get members, lots of women were joining the group, politely asking, please may we have the vote? No, you may not have the vote. They decided to go militant, and it was called militancy. Setting fire to pillar boxes, either setting fire to them or putting acid into them, so the letters all disappeared. Bombing empty houses, chaining themselves to railings, anything to get publicity, not actually attacking, not exactly attacking cabinet ministers as they walked between Westminster and Whitehall, or the other way around. It's only walking distance. They use cars today, on the whole. The women decided that they were going to sort of harass these men. They weren't going to do anything illegal. They weren't going to hit them. They were just going to be a nuisance. We're going to get hold of their coats and say, why can't we have the vote? Votes for women, or wear placards, or try and give leaflets to the cabinet ministers as they walked from Westminster to Whitehall, or the other way around. Or just stand in front of them so that they couldn't move along the pavement. Nothing dramatic. They didn't, steal their top hats or anything like that. But they were a nuisance and they were an embarrassment. And that worked quite well. The plan was to get themselves put in prison, to go before a court, all good publicity, get in the papers, go to court, make another statement to the judge, we want the vote, that's all we're asking for. Then be put in prison. And then, I'm sure you all know, another technique they decided upon, democratically, it was a very democratic organisation, to go on hunger strike when they got to prison. That would get publicity, that would get in the papers. And of course it did. These women willing to starve themselves in order, because of their principle, they wanted the vote, they wanted equality. Then, 1913, the Cat and Mouse Act, it wasn't called that, it had another title, but it was nicknamed the Cat and Mouse Act, because women were literally willing to starve themselves to death. The government decided they couldn't let this happen. Obviously, they couldn't let women actually die in prison. That would be a scandal. So what they would do was, they'd force-fed them. That was a scandal. That was horrible. It was like a form of torture. Putting I think it was like a hose pipe, quite strong, nasty rubber, not like they use in hospitals. Not a nice gentle pipe, but push some horrible thing like a hose pipe down their throat, up their nose, down inside them, and then pour what was like gruel. It was food. It was sort of liquid food, and of course they choked. They choked and spluttered. And one famous aristocratic lady, who was in bad health anyway, submitted herself to this force feeding, and it's sort of like a gruel kind of mixture, like soup and porridge mixed, went into her lungs instead of her stomach, and she recovered, but her health was ruined. She was never well again. She hadn't been well before. So the suffragette had actually said, "You don't need to submit yourself to this." And she said, "But I do want to. It's a sisterhood. It's a sisterhood. We must all share in the whatever we did, whatever's decided. I want to belong." And because she was an aristocrat, she had been given permission, and because of her health problems, not to go on hunger strike and not to be force-fed. But no. So the Cat and Mouse Act was wait until the woman was really, really ill. She'd been without food for weeks, possibly. Then release her from prison. Her family would feed her again, feed her back to health. And then, because she'd not completed her sentence, she would be rearrested, do more time in Holloway. she'd starve again, they'd let her out, and this would go on and on, like a cat playing with a mouse. Very controversial, very, very controversial. And then, of course, we've got 1913, the death at Epsom of the campaigner Emily Davidson. And it was the King's horse that she was trying to get hold of. She was the big controversy even today. Did she intend to commit suicide? The jury is out, but most people think, no, she didn't intend to commit suicide. She had a return ticket in her bag, train ticket, and she hadn't said anything to her friends about intending to commit suicide. And she was a loner. She didn't always discuss what she was going to do with the committee. That was what's supposed to happen. It was supposed to be a very democratic organisation. If you had any great ideas of a way of attracting attention, then you were supposed to fly it past the committee, and they would say, no, it's a terrible idea, or yes, it's a good idea, go ahead. And she hadn't discussed it. She hadn't discussed it, but then she'd done other things like locking herself in the House of Commons. And coming bouncing out of a cupboard in the morning to everybody's surprise, and actually locking herself in the House of Commons, or getting herself locked in, then out of the census. So when it said, you know, where are you reside? What is your place of residence? She put the House of Commons. So she was full of ideas. She was a loner, a maverick. But it isn't believed now that she intended to kill herself. She wanted to pull the King's horse to a standstill. She seemed to think that if she could get hold of the horse's bridle, she could make it stop. And that would all get in the papers. That would be massive, wonderful publicity. And it would ruin the race. And the King and Queen were actually there. King George and Queen Mary were there at the Epsom Derby. So that was the plan, that she was going to rush across into the oncoming horses, grab the reins and pull the horse so that it wasn't in the race anymore. And the horse pulled her over. She died 4 days later of her injuries. So this was all happening in only 3 years after the king had come to the throne. All these problems, all these enormous difficulties, to which nobody really had a solution apart from the constitutional crisis, which was dealt with very quickly. But all these other problems arose. It was a real baptism of fire for George V. And then, of course, we got the Irish Home Rule problem, which was coming to the boil. It was becoming worse and worse. The issue being, of course, that the Irish had for many years been fighting for independence, way back, long before Gladstone. But Gladstone is associated with this, of course, because he finally agreed that the Irish could have home rule, they could be independent. But then the problem arose that the Northern Irish, the Ulstermen, didn't want to be part of Catholic Ireland. They very fiercely resented the idea. They wanted to stay with the United Kingdom and were willing to fight. And there was a civil war brewing. So what was going to happen about that? How would that be resolved? It seemed to be growing more and more of a problem, and nobody seemed to have the answer. So poor George V had all these difficulties, all these problems to deal with. I ended by saying post-Edwardian Britain was a difficult legacy for the new inexperienced king and queen, a baptism of fire. So the years before the First World War were not tranquil. It wasn't a golden age of Edwardian calm and everybody wearing, you know, the women wearing lovely long dresses and beautiful big hats, and the men all looking elegant in top hats. And it wasn't all Headley regattas and picnics and wonderful weather. It was a time of turmoil and enormous problems. And many people actually saying, is it the end of the world? Is it, everything seems to be so wrong? Even before the war broke out, everything seems to be changing. and we can sort of understand that. We're sort of in a similar situation now. So, you know, we can sort of disregard this old myth that the First World War spoiled everything, and before that, our ancestors were all happy and content, and, you know, there's a golden age. Not at all. So next time, we will do I know I've been saying this for quite a long time, the lead up to the First World War, and we'll take it from there. And thank you very much indeed for listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Judy.
Before we go our separate ways, Judy and I were having a chat before we started, whilst I fed her biscuits.
You sound like a puppy.
I think we'll probably get 2 more sessions in before we have a summer break, the 20th of June and the 4th of July. And our working assumption is we'll have a summer break and then come back in some form or other in September, the 5th of September. Now, to some extent, how we come back depends on how Judy is. She confessed to me this morning in the car, she's getting very exasperated that she's not able to gamble up and down Sutton High Street in the way that she used to. So we don't know whether Judy will be fit enough to do something at the town, at the URC. But we're hopeful. We're hoping that we'll be back in September and we'll be able to have some form of getting together. The consensus was not clear on the response from the group. To be honest, there were more people who said they would be happier carrying on as we're going. Just slightly more in favor of carrying on with Zoom meetings. The problem with that is it only takes care of those people who've got technology. And there are 30 people who aren't able to join us on this marvel called a Zoom meeting. So that's the way we've concluded we'll leave it. When we do come back in September, we're planning to put the clock back and go back to Saxons or
Even Romans.
even Romans was Judy's suggestion this morning.
Great, great, great.
And I don't think we've done Romans before, Judy.
No, we haven't.
No.
We've got summer to bone up on it. So there we are, just as mixed views from people, but slightly more people a bit cautious than I expected. 2 more sessions, 20th of June and the 4th of July, and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much indeed for your support, folks.
Yes.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very
you.
much,
Thank you.
Judy. Thank you, Martin.
Stay well.
Bye.
Martin.